Hey pals, welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be talking about palettes and when to break them. This is a topic that I haven't really spent too much time getting into in the channel, but more and more as I work on my game Insignia, I tend to find myself covering this topic in my own work. And so given that it's kind of been absent from the channel, I thought I would make a video covering it. So let's get straight into it. So this is our topic question: should you ever break the palette? And particularly among beginners, I know that adhering to a palette tends to be one of those anxiety points where, you've just started learning pixel art, you've just started learning about palettes, and you know that there are rules around, pixel perfect games and adhering to a palette where people might think that your pixel art isn't very good or isn't, true pixel art if you break one of these rules. And sticking to the palette seems to be one of those things. And I think there's a real disconnect between this kind of thinking and the reality of how games that get shipped actually look and the way they do or don't adhere to palettes. So I'm just going to start simple here. Let's ask the first question, and that is, what is a palette? A palette is just a limited selection of colors picked to compose your image. What that basically means is that, the idea is that you limit yourself to a portion of the spectrum with, few colors, and that's going to give your game or your art a kind of identity that's not random, right? It feels strong. It feels like a decision that you made to put it in a more saturated space or a more pastel space or more dramatic. In this case, we've got something that feels like it was designed for like the Game Boy. So this kind of sepia tone feels a bit more nostalgic. And the reason why it feels that way is because it's not consisting of every other color in the spectrum. This idea of coffee-stained maps and old pages informs our understanding of what these colors kind of can represent or can mean. And the fact that we aren't seeing a bunch of other colors is why we can say this has a specific style, right? So it's specifically about limitation on purpose. Not all palettes are small, some are quite large, and particularly in games where you have lots of environments and different characters and colors, you do want something representative of the spectrum, but you want to be able to do it in a way that's, more limited to give yourself some kind of structure. So this leads us to the next question of, what do we use palettes for? So palettes are really there to give you some kind of structure. They can simplify the color selection process. So picking your palette at the beginning of a project, particularly a game project where you've got lots of different assets, this gives you some kind of center point and starting place where you really don't have to be too creative or too careful about picking your colors because they've been picked for you. They also create a consistency across those sprites. So if you're going to be drawing some timber, you want that same color of timber to be there across everywhere where you're using a wood texture, at least to start somewhere where if you were to change it, you would be making an informed decision to change it. So having there be a point of consistency just makes it easier to manage. And it also establishes a style, as we mentioned earlier. So we can see here, this artist's style is very consistent. And the fact that they use the same palette across all of their work makes their work more recognizable. And I believe this art is from the artist Fool on the Pixel Joint forums. All of their work has this kind of tone to it, and it makes it very recognizable. I always come back to this work, particularly this forum post on the Pixel Joint forums called I Don't Get Color Theory, or Coloring, I Don't Get It. It's a sticky post there, and you can find it. I'll put it in the description for you. It's probably worth mentioning also why we might need a style. So a style helps you find your audience more quickly if the tone is strong. So if you're making a horror game and the palette complements the genre of the game that you're making, people will be able to recognize what kind of game you're making just by looking at the screenshots, right? The palette helps reinforce that. It also helps people recognize your work more easily among the competition. So having a style that is unique, or at least has some originality to it, means that your game or your work will stand out even in the genre that it's in. It also, very importantly, makes your games and your work look more professional, avoiding that kind of asset flip identity. It's really important to mention, style is more than just color. So all of the things that I've said are true, but they're not the whole picture. You can have a game that's got different color and different sort of tones and all the different art choices that you've got and all the different assets that you've got, even if it is an asset flipped game, but you could still kind of create a sense of style in other ways. These things can and will, of course, contribute to establishing some kind of identity for your game and style. I want to take you now through a list of games and look at them with this conversation in mind. So how well they actually stick to a palette. Here we have Momodora, Moonlit Farewell. This is a very recent release as of me recording this video. And you can see here the scene is very nicely composed. There are a lot of very subtle colors that we see, particularly in the background and in the very foreground. So the areas that mean less to us visually have very subtle color changes. We also see procedural kind of gradients here for the lighting. We see these sort of god rays, these shafts of light. They affect the color. We see a distortion with the water that's also affecting the color. And so definitely this game is not sticking just to one palette, right? This artist has not gone to low spec and just downloaded something and used that exclusively to paint every color. So straight off the bat, you can see there's a lot of creative license at play when creating a frame. And a lot of the choices here that have gone into composing this image, choices that make the image more effective, contradict the idea of actually, sticking to a palette, right? If this game just stuck to a palette, it would be much harder to render such a subtle image. Particularly those nuances around light would be lost if we had to stick to a palette. Here we have Blasphemous 2, and Blasphemous is a game that actually does adhere quite well to a lot of the limitations of, I guess, what you would call a classic pixel art game, in that there are very few, if any, transparent pixels, right? Everything that you look at could be rendered as a sprite and just kind of like pasted into the scene. There's not really any lighting effects or any vignetting or any kind of color effect that's sort of like post-processed. This is all just straight art on the screen. The question, however, of whether or not a palette was involved is kind of harder to answer just because of how subtle a lot of these color changes are. I want to draw your attention specifically to the brickwork here. These subtle shades of gray and brown and the very, very minor hue shifting among the edges of one brick, right? These are colors that if we were to make a palette, that represented all the colors in this, there would be so many different shades of brown that would be effectively not worth doing. I do want to call out, however, the separation between the layers in the scene is very clear, and that all of the colors behind the action are muted and dulled in a specific direction. You can see there's almost like a purple tint towards kind of like a black-brown purple in the back, where even this art was probably created at a higher contrast in a different set of colors and has been sort of tinted or muted down to fit better in the background. That's something that is very common in professional pixel art, and particularly pixel art for games, where the foreground action and the background needs to be separate. So definitely in Blasphemous's case, although it is kind of very faithful pixel art, it's definitely not using exclusively some palette. Another example, Eastwood. Eastwood is known for its very careful, nuanced use of post-processing effects. You can see the sort of light bleed off the top of the screen. They often use kind of like vignetting and chromatic aberration even. So the edges of pixels are, more red on one side and more blue on the other. Kind of like retro aesthetic, right? It feels like we're looking at the art on a CRT monitor. And it's really important to reflect on the fact that even when games were made with the limitations of consoles back in the day, CRT monitors, big box TVs, didn't really have perfect color reproduction or even perfect rendering in their pixels, right? The actual blurring of those pixels and the way that we see here in Eastwood, the sort of almost like a smearing, right? Like a natural anti-aliasing. That was something that was common in the day. So using these post-processing effects to achieve a more retro aesthetic is something that's done. And of course, in this case, the palette is not respected one-to-one. I will say this is very stylized, right? So there's clearly in Eastwood a palette, right? There are colors that you see come up again and again. And the idea that a palette is broken sometimes is not the same as there not being a palette. And that's probably even the case with Blasphemous. So today we're talking about breaking palettes, but of course having a palette is something that's very valuable. And it's clear that Eastwood at least has a core sort of tonal center and reuses colors, all the time in its work. Here we have another very recent example. This is Sea of Stars. And of course, Sea of Stars, known for its procedural lighting with kind of like real shadows for all the characters and the work. So in this game, obviously, because there's a lot of post-processing, you're going to see colors that sort of like break the palette, so to speak. But it is clear that in the artwork, there are colors that have been used to create the art that are consistent across some kind of a palette. You can see here, if we ignore the shadows and the post-processed lighting, that the assets themselves were created with some kind of palette in this scene at the very least. So in AEST or whatever sprite editor they were using, right, there is work and care taken to create art that is faithful before all the post-processing is done. Definitely not an exclusive palette. So you can see, on the trees themselves, there seems to be kind of like different hues that the trees kind of lean towards as they go up, right? So this one here is a little more yellow. This one's a little more desaturated, sort of light green. This one goes up to like a more saturated green. And so there's definitely variance, but it feels like that variation is done at an engine level, not at the art asset level. I also want to call out, of course, the mist in the background is creating a lot of separation between the main scene and the background. And all of these assets back here were probably created with the same palette as the foreground assets, but because there's so much of that white that's separating them, obviously that knocks them back and it changes the final color that we see in the screenshot. And finally, we have Potion Permit. So here in Potion Permit, you can see a lot of the colors are very faithful, and this was probably created with a palette. All of the browns that we see here are essentially the exact same colors. The grass, it's all pretty much exactly the same. And even, the colors that are chosen here for the leaves, though they look a little more saturated, they're actually probably the same greens that we're seeing here as well. The only difference being that the outline gives them that a little more sense of popping, and the reds here are being used to create a little bit more sort of color contrast. So this, I would guess, is using a palette and is quite faithful to the palette. So you can see here in this screenshot, compared to the other examples, it's maybe looking a little bit flatter because of the lack of the post-processing that we see in the other examples, but some of that could be chalked up to style. It's very easy on the eyes, it's very painterly in a lot of these areas, and I think that's to its credit. So let's summarize some of the things that we've covered looking at those examples, down to a little set of guidelines that I can give you. I think you can break the palette to achieve high priority design goals. That's what I would say. So as long as you have some intent and a reason to break the palette, then I think as long as that reason is louder or more high priority, then I think you should do it. So in this case, we've seen examples to make the foreground and the background more distinct. That's a reason to break the palette. To achieve subtle details in low focus areas. So if you have very, very fine examples like in Momodora, right? Those background blues, we want them to be very close together because they're really not important in the scene, but they give us some nuance. That's an example where you could use it. And to bridge between palette colors more gracefully. So if you have, browns and greens, and the brown ramp that you're using in your palette is very different from the green ramp, you might want to add some colors if you're doing something in the background between the two to help bridge them. So basically this is about creating and establishing visual hierarchy, and ultimately making sure that your screenshot at the end of the day, what comes out on the screen, needs to be satisfying, right? So it's worth calling out most of these modern effects, lighting, shadows, post-processing like vignetting, any transparent VFX, any blurring or chromatic aberration, those things technically break the palette. So your kind of mission here is to be tasteful with how you use it, right? As long as the way that you use these things is consistent with the overall visual aesthetic that you're going for and consistent internally, I don't see a problem with breaking the palette in that instance if it means creating a stronger image. Pixel art is a growing and changing kind of medium. We live in a time where a lot of games are being made, a lot of indie games with pixel art are being made. It's a very competitive space, and it's common because of how expedient it is and how effective it is to use post-processing. I don't think that you should stylistically limit yourself to what an old console could do in 2024. That isn't to say though that you can't do that, right? There are plenty of games like the Shovel Knight series that adhere quite closely to the idea of a palette, and games that are specifically retro throwbacks that use pixel art, they might have a different set of constraints that they're looking to follow than just a game that uses pixel art in 2024. So know what you're trying to do, and be purposeful about how you use these effects. I want to give you a tip here for those of you who are watching this video who have been using palettes and are kind of maybe a little bit scared of the idea that what I'm suggesting is to just throw everything out. Don't throw your palette out. I think palettes are an incredible way of giving yourself some kind of structural basis from which to establish your game's visual identity. That's really important. And I think that when you work, if you find yourself in a position where you feel like you need to add a color for whatever you're doing, because at the asset level, you want there to be a more subtle distinction between two things. You're not at the engine level yet. Maybe you're designing a background for a scene in your sprite editor of choice, and the palette that you're using has too much contrast in it to create some subtle tints. Maybe it's like shades of blue in a sky, or clouds that are very far in the background, kind of like coming towards the screen and blending with clouds in the foreground. If you're at that point where you need to add a color, add the color. Feel free to blend the colors and find middle points where you need to, but do not, unless you're very confident, change those colors. That's my recommendation, right? All of this is just advice. And if you feel confident enough that you can create a strong image without these guidelines, then so be it. There will be exceptions. But typically, I think if you keep the colors, the root colors consistent, so that palette that you started with, right? If the red is the same red every time you load up your new canvas, at the very least, you have that point of consistency. So try not to change those base colors. So I'd like to give you some examples now of some work that I'm working on where I'm doing some palette-y things, shifting the palette or adding colors between it, and just showing you my experience. So here we have some tile sets from Insignia's kind of like new demo that I'm working on. And I'm really liking the way that it looks. Particularly, I'm liking how subtle the difference in color is between these two shades, right? Those shades right on the border between kind of like the what I call the black point of the tile set and the more brighter areas. So, you know, you always have one color that's kind of like the dead color, right? Where you don't see any more tile detail. And what I like to do in more recent examples is to have a color very, very close to that to sort of suggest that last level of light as we, you know, recede down to the darkest color. This color this one here is not in my palette, right? It fits in well because it follows the same ramp as the color that I've got here. So if you're looking at the bottom left of my screen down here, you can see as I pan from this to this to this, you can see that arc kind of coming, this way. The colors are consistent in the way that they are changing in hue and brightness and saturation. So it fits in the ramp, but it's not part of my palette. I was also experimenting with the idea of some like more, I guess, dead looking grass. So, you know, rather than starting where we have it here, maybe going for something a little more either darker in this direction or even starting a little bit lighter, but less saturated, something like this, just to give the scene a bit more of like a sunsetty look or a little bit more emotionally, I don't know, tense. I know that's a weird thing to say, but you know, in the first chapter of my game, there's this sense that I want of something ending, right? Like an innocence kind of ending. And when you're running through the fields at the beginning of the game, you know, I want you to almost feel like maybe this is the last time I'll be coming through here. So having the, you know, more sepia, a little less saturated grass is something that I'm playing with the idea of, you know, helping kind of push that feeling of like, oh, you know, things aren't quite as happy and bright and saturated as you know, the world that the game is painted in suggests. Now here's another example from much later in the game. And you can see here I'm using additional colors in a way that I have never done it before. And I think the result is very compelling, but I think there's a lot of work to be done here. So you can see here, I've got a lot more colors. I've just like kind of gone caution to the wind and just gone crazy, right? I actually started with colors that are in my base palette. I think these colors here are all from my base palette. But from there, I thought, you know what? Screw it. I'll just blend as much as I want. I'll find the colors that I want and just go for it. What I like about this is that it's given me the license to do things like having this purple hue on the bounce light. This idea that it's like nighttime, and even though there is like a main light source lighting the game from above, that there is this sort of like secondary light source, this more global light that is kind of finding its way into the cracks and crevices of the tile set. I really like that idea, and it's something that I probably wouldn't have gone for if I was just sticking to my palette without the confidence to add all those subtle steps between the colors. And I've probably, more than just a little bit in this palette, shifted the colors to be closer to each other so that I could find that the continuity in the work a little more easily. So, you know, rather than just saying, well, this is my brown and this is my purple and wherever they land, so what? It's more like, well, maybe I'll add a color here, or I'll change these a little bit to be closer to each other, just to sort of let it kind of flow a little more easily. Where I think this fails, and I think I have to put a little bit more work into this, one is that I have a lot of stray colors that I need to have decisions for. So this is still work in progress, and a lot of the details aren't, you know, totally figured out yet. But, you know, ideally, if I can achieve the same effect as what I'm going for here with as few colors as possible, I think that will work better. So like these two here, if these are both in the canvas, one of them should be there and the other one shouldn't, right? I should be using the same color for these because they're so similar. I can't think of a good reason why I would have, you know, two of them. So things like that, I'd just like to be a bit more pedantic about. And also, I think here we're missing a little bit on the topic of contrast. There's just something about this scene when I look at it where I feel like the range of the colors isn't quite high enough consistently. So like this into this, into this, into this feels blurred. It feels like we're looking at the scene through a lens that's very slightly purple and mostly transparent. And I'd just like some of that clarity to be back in this scene. I think it's okay on the tile set itself, right? And I do think that this is supposed to be knocked back, like it's definitely a more background element, but there's something about the entire scene that just feels a little washed out, that having no, you know, forced palette has kind of invited that effect into the canvas, where in other areas I don't have that problem because I have a clear canvas that has a lot of contrast from the beginning. So being more careful about that stuff is really important. And here's another example. This is one more tile set that I've been working on very, very recently that I'm very happy about. I really like where this is going. Here, I've mostly actually stuck very well to my base palette. So all of these colors are palette colors, except for some very, very subtle tones between my black point color and the nearest kind of like gray that I've got. I'm not really like changing that black point. I'm not making it different. So all of the things that are black in the game are the same shade of black, which is really important. But just to kind of create a bit more of a subtle suggestion from here up into the actual details themselves, I've added a color just to kind of soften that, because I don't want you looking so hard here. Only if your eyes kind of wander down there do I want you to even really notice what's going on. I've also, I think, added or done a bit of hue shifting around this dirt. As I was working on this dirt variation, I was feeling this kind of like Stardew Valley kind of vibe. The very orange dirt was something that I thought was kind of interesting. And the dirt colors that I had at the time, these are a little bit further apart and the contrast was quite high. So I've shifted it to be a little bit more saturated and a little bit lower contrast across those four colors. And that's allowed it to serve its function a little bit more gracefully without, you know, changing the core temperature. So like I've made the choice in this example, again, for almost like an emotional reason. This is the scene before that less saturated grassy scene. This is more like home. And I kind of want home to feel a little bit more fresh and a little bit more like a place that you want to be, because then maybe leaving it, the change in color might give you something. It's just something I'm experimenting with. But I think this is like a valid reason to change the palette if it clears the image a little bit more, balances the contrast, allows it to be more readable, and serves some kind of design function in the game. Okay, so I hope that's giving you a little bit more context into palettes in general and kind of good reasons to break them if you feel like you're going to. This is something that I'm still working at, as you can see, and that I will be sharing more of as Insignia gets a little bit closer to being kind of more, I guess, consumer facing. I'm actually working on a demo at the moment for the game ahead of some funding rounds. So I will need to have a demo and a Steam page and a few things like that up in the next couple of months. And I'm working very hard to get that in place. So look forward to seeing more polished art around the game and more gameplay stuff. Also, as I mentioned in the previous video, I'm currently running what I'm now calling like a feature test for the game. People in our Discord channel and who watch the stream have been able to play sections of the game, or particularly like experiences of the game, a platforming area and a combat area, and give immediate feedback while I'm working on it. So that's something that I'm continuing to add to as I work on this demo. If you're interested, definitely come and check it out. Join us on Discord and get into the feature test program. Okay, thank you so much, pals. Hope you learned something in this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.